Now, I can genuinely say I am so excited about our next conversation. We're looking at the top 5 things you never knew about Port Macquarie. Now, Port Macquarie is an amazing place, as we all know, for so many reasons. But one that often gets overlooked is our history. The story of our European settlement is fascinating and still evident around town today. We were home to Australia's first commercial sugar crops. Perhaps you never knew that. I certainly didn't. World War II came surprisingly close to Port Macquarie, and Port Macquarie has a very special link to Australia's first Prime Minister. So why don't more of us know about this kind of guff? Tonight we aim to cure our collective ignorance with members of the Port Macquarie Historical Society. Debbie Summers and Linda Turner join me tonight in Time to Talk Studios. G'day to you both.
Hello, how are you, Tim?
I'm really well, thanks for joining us. Now, the Biripi people, they maintained their connection with Port Macquarie for more than 60,000 years. Now, that's staggering. We just throw that out there, 60,000 years, but it is staggering. And they have an amazing affinity with this land. I've been very privileged to listen to some of the elders talk about their connection with the Port Macquarie land. But all that changed, Debbie, in 1821, didn't it? Tell us about how Governor Macquarie changed the course of Port Macquarie's history in 1821.
Well, Tim, what happened in 1821, in fact in April 1821, the very first arrivals for the penal settlement arrived here at Port Macquarie, and that was very much to change the course of our history. So earlier in 1818, John Oxley had explored these parts and indeed much of New South Wales and determined that he thought Port Macquarie would make a very ideal place for a settlement here. And he communicated that to Governor Macquarie, and after a couple of visits back, it was determined that we would establish, or they would establish, a penal colony here for secondary offenders. So they were the convicts who had already been transported from England to the colony of New South Wales, and but they'd re-offended since they'd been here, and so they were then placed in what they called a secondary punishment.
Wow, is that right?
Settlement, yes.
Can I just go back to John Oxley too, because his name is all around Port Macquarie. We have John Oxley Drive, and we have the Oxley Highway, obviously named after him. So he's an important man. He was essentially an explorer. Is that fair enough to say? He was. He was also a surveyor, and but he thought there was an inland sea to be found in New South Wales, and so under Macquarie's governorship, he was encouraged to go and explore for that. And let me
didn't find one.
Didn't find one. But I'm just interested to note something that he said. I was doing a little bit of research today because I wanted to keep up with you two ladies, and I didn't want to appear like a complete fool tonight because I don't know much about Port Macquarie's history, I have to admit. John Oxley, he noted in one of his books that the port abounds, this is what he wrote, the port abounds with fish, the sharks were larger and more numerous than I've ever observed before. Independent of the Hastings River, the area is generally well watered, and there is a fine spring at the very entrance to the port. He wrote so eloquently about our area, didn't he? He
did. An idyllic setting, really. Not necessarily an idyllic setting for a penal settlement, but yes, I think most explorers had a sense of romanticism about them, and certainly Oxley was an excellent scribe. And also he wanted to sell the place to Macquarie, no doubt.
And when he sold the place as a penal settlement, is it true to say that it was also considered ideal because of its convicts couldn't escape to the sea, and if they went inland towards Wauchope, they would have not made it very far. There's a great distance, and it was not rugged terrain but difficult to escape from.
Well, indeed, it was very isolated, and the reason that it was going to be made a secondary place of punishment was because Newcastle was quite close to Sydney, and that was the previous place for secondary offenders. But the settlement of Sydney was moving further out towards Newcastle, and it was becoming increasingly easy for convicts to escape and go back into the mainstream. Mingle with free settlers. So that was very much...
We didn't want them mingling with free settlers,
definitely not.
No. So they thought that the place would be quite isolated for some time, and that it would take the free settlement some time to move from Newcastle up the north coast to here, which indeed it did.
Sometimes when we think about Australia's convict history, in a general sense, we think of it being quite brutal and severe. Was that the case in Port Macquarie?
In many cases, yes, it was. The hardship the harsh conditions were indeed pretty much the same throughout many of the penal settlements, but certainly in this isolated setting, much worse. They had to work extremely long hours, and everything was, of course, manual labour. So they were building buildings, they were cutting timber, they were involved. They were in the river itself for a lot of the time, perhaps. So yes, it was quite harsh. And
when we talk about even building buildings, we literally mean making the bricks, don't we, Linda?
Well,
everything.
Making the bricks and marking the bricks, and the old plan of the jail, and there are early photographs that we have of the jail, or when it was in a dilapidated state after it was in an asylum as well. It was... pretty rough place to be.
Where was the jail?
Up on the headland.
Really?
Yes, where Lions Lookout is.
Is that up near town?
Right up
top
on,
of town
right
beach?
Up on the headland.
It was there, was it?
Yes.
Wow,
yes.
at least they had a nice view.
I don't think they had much time to see it, really, but yes, they did. And we have to remember too, many of the convicts weren't tradesmen as such. Many of them were sent here for things like forgery, larceny, stealing, etc. So they didn't have building skills. I mean, many of them were master craftsmen. They were excellent at writing, and they were often artists who could forge other people's artwork or forge your signature or mine very easily. So the quality of their building skills was quite in doubt as well. But that's what they were here to do, and that's what they did.
So when you say the quality of their building skills was in doubt, does that mean that the evidence that we can see around Port Macquarie today, and most people know about St Thomas's Church, maybe the most classic example. I know there are a lot more examples too, and I'd love to hear what they are. But, are they quite crude examples of buildings?
Very, very much so. And in fact, that's why a lot of our built heritage from the convict period no longer exists, because the quality of the building was very poor. The materials were quite poor as well. Wow. The clay in this area wasn't very good.
Clay and the lime they used. So what happened is that many of the buildings were, not only pulled down, but also they were falling down anyway, and that's why they were pulled down. And in fact, St Thomas's Church has had an enormous, almost from the time it was built, it has been under restoration.
Is that right?
I think the first services were held in 1828, and already it was shortly after that time that they started talking about certain parts of the building needed repairs.
Is that right? Well, that's what you get when you don't get an expert to put in the hard yards. Yeah. And so what about women convicts in this area? Because I've read a little bit about female convicts in our area. They came about a year after the first convicts, I understand. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there weren't a great deal of them, but there was a separate female jail, or female factory as they were called, and it was actually adjoining the male factory or the male jail. So the women often complained about the smells and sounds, etc., coming from the men's side. But most of the women here were sent to work, and most of them ended up working for soldiers, officers of the government, and also then after 1830 with free settlers. So Port Macquarie opened up to free settlement in 1830, and many of the convict women were then assigned to do domestic work, basically looking after the children, cooking, cleaning, etc. And then they would come back to the female factory and make nails sometimes, and cook and clean there too.
And so where can we see evidence of our convict past in Port Macquarie besides St Thomas's Church? Where can we see it?
You can visibly see it at the glass house now, because there is an excellent barrel drain under the glass house. You don't even have to go into the glass house, actually. You can see it from out. Well, it's actually quite a sophisticated drainage system that was there for the first overseers' cottages that were built here to support the penal settlement, and there's quite a few underneath the glasshouse as well. So when you go downstairs in the glasshouse, you can see that work quite clearly. But much of our convict heritage has been pulled down. The Port Macquarie Historical Museum, where we reside at 22 Clarence Street, I'll give it a plug, the front building is made of convict bricks, and there are many convict bricks. When they started pulling down the buildings here from about 1850 onwards, and certainly even right into the 1900s. Those bricks, those that remained or were usable, were often taken by people and put into their own buildings. So there's a lot of convict bricks around the town in
fireplaces
places.
and barbecues and things like that, showing, because the convict, Debbie knows the different teams, for want of a better word, of convicts had different marks.
Is that right?
Yes, and you'll see bricks with the cat's paw on it, or
I see.
And certain types of arrows, certain types,
broad arrow, or
so they could designate which team had created
well, they
those
knew
bricks.
who was making those bricks, and they'd know who was working
They probably
the
had
hardest.
quotas and everything. Yeah.
They probably had quotas.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell us about Coolumbung Park or Coolumbung Reserve. There is a cemetery there, and when I walk around there are so many interesting grave sites. Have we got a lot to learn about our history at that site?
Yes, very much so. Unfortunately, a lot of the graves don't survive today, and those that do, the headstones are in
They're very hard to read.
Yes, they are in disrepair. Many moons ago, in fact, Linda, may I say, Linda did spend some time in a coffin many years ago when
Now that's something I don't hear every day.
No, you don't. And when the Port Macquarie Historical Society launched their book, The Winding Sheet, which is actually about all the people who are buried in our historic cemetery there. We actually have a book that tells all the stories of the people buried there, those who do have headstones and those who don't.
That's taking your research to extreme measures, though, getting in a coffin. What's all that about?
Well, Debbie hasn't quite told the story.
It was particularly harsh here, and that is reflected in the type of people who were buried in the cemetery.
Really briefly, who are some of the other characters that, as Port Macquarie locals, we just should know about? I mean, there's Allman. Is it Francis Allman?
Yes, Francis Allman.
Why should we know about him? Because he's so important in our history, isn't he?
Well, he is. He actually set up the penal settlement here.
So he was the first
commandant, if you like.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, the more we read about him or learn about him, he was quite a gentleman, and he came here with his wife and children as well.
Did he live in Roto House?
No, he never lived in Roto House.
Is that a rumour, is it?
Yes. I'm happy to come and talk to you all about Roto House and the family on another occasion.
All right, as long as we've dispelled the myth, that's all right.
Yes,
yeah.
I can go into great detail, but we won't do that tonight, perhaps. But no, Francis Allman didn't live in Roto House. That was built many years later.
Okay.
In fact, it was built about 70 years later.
Right.
After Captain Allman, but he was I believe, a good man, and he had the right skills. He was able to, if you like, encourage the people who he brought with him first to build the settlement up. And he brought his wife and children. They all lived here, which was quite a big, it must have been an amazing thing to do.
He seems like a real people man too.
He was very much a people man.
Yeah,
and it was, I think, the right sort of person to come here. But you've got to remember, they came here with absolutely nothing other than what they brought with them.
And their housing would have been pretty rough.
It was very rough, incredibly so.
Now, did he come in on a ship called the Lady Nelson?
There were 3 ships in our first fleet. The Lady Nelson was one of them.
Right.
Yes. And in fact, the Lady Nelson was very special to Governor Mccrory. He had a real soft spot for the Lady Nelson.
But she was actually our first shipwreck.
She was our first shipwreck.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So she was one of our first ships in and one of our first ships wrecked.
Yes,
indeed.
But she was so well liked and such a probably stable ship that Macquarie decided that he wanted her repaired, and so
he really did have an affinity with this ship.
He did. He had a very soft spot for the Lady Nelson.
And the wharf, of course, on the town green is called Lady Nelson Wharf.
That's right.
After that ship. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And tell us about the shipwrecks, because it was very underestimated, this part of the coast, wasn't it? And there were a lot of shipwrecks, a lot of, it seems, quite arrogant captains thought that they could make it through.
Well, actually, Linda will talk a little bit about the shipwrecks, but before we do that, I think that, yes, they were, but also Oxley had written what a safe and wonderful looking harbour it was. And we have to remember that. So when they came here, they really, and Oxley had been back a couple of times, so, the view was that it would be okay. I mean, I won't say easy, but it would be manageable.
It looks gentle, doesn't it?
Yes.
Even today, people underestimate our bar, don't they, when they come across it? So, it's not surprising that back then, with ships being less sophisticated, there was
known in the sailing world as a very notorious bar.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the shipwrecks around early Port Macquarie's history?
Well, with Lady Nelson was the first one. We've got another very famous one was the Wanderer, and we have an actual convict diary that gives an eyewitness account of the wreck of the Wanderer.
Is that right?
And how Captain Otterwell told the captain of the Wanderer not to cross the bar because the draft was too deep, and they wouldn't do it. And so they did. They tried to cross it, and of course got wrecked on the sandbar.
It's time to talk.
So now, sugar crops. Apparently we were one of Australia's first commercial sugar plantations or sugar industries here in Port Macquarie.
Indeed. The sugar dates back here to the 1820s, not really quite soon after the penal settlement, and to the founding father of the Australian sugar industry, Thomas Scott, who was employed to look after and grow the sugar crops here. And interestingly enough, the first commercial sugar crops from here were sold in Sydney at auction in 1827. So we are really the founding place of sugar in Australia.
So where were these sugar plantations? Because when we think of sugar cane and sugar crops, we think of Queensland, don't we? Some people might think Port Macquarie doesn't have a climate for sugar crops.
No,
but
indeed.
And we don't seem to grow sugar here now, so why back then? And did it work? Was it successful?
Well, Scott was keen to get employment here in the colonies, if you like, in New South Wales, and so he pushed very hard, and he thought that the climate would be ideal, and so it was grown out on what we call the penal settlement farms out at Rollins Plains.
Okay, right.
And the crops were not particularly successful. And what happened to those farms? And they were growing many other crops as well, maize and tobacco, as well as sugar. But when free settlement started here in 1830, those farms were put up for lease, for tender.
Okay.
And so sugar sort of stopped around that time, and hadn't been particularly successful. There was concerns about the quality of the sugar, and obviously there were concerns about the climate. But then eventually what happened was so the sugar, if you like, stopped at that time. So when free settlement came, no one kept growing sugar here.
It just sounds like it was far too frustrating an exercise.
It was, and no one had the inclination. But then in the 1860s, there was a Methodist minister in this area called Reverend Holland, and he was concerned because many of the farmers here were growing maize and only maize or corn, and the prices for corn had dropped to really low prices. And so, being a member of the clergy, he was visiting people who were really suffering and had very little income to get by on, and he encouraged them to diversify. And he had a small farm in Port Macquarie, around Westport Park area there, and he started growing sugar there, very small quantity of sugar. And he said he thought they could do it. So he encouraged people along the Manning River and here along the Hastings to grow sugar. And so there was a lot of sugar grown here in the 1860s and 1870s. And there were some very large mills established along the Hastings and some quite small ones.
And did he manage to achieve what his predecessor didn't manage to achieve?
Well, I guess he did. He certainly encouraged a lot of people to grow sugar. And there was something like, I have to look at my notes, but something like about 30 odd, in the 1860s and 1870s, there were about 30 odd sugar growers in the Hastings area alone. But the same things happened. So the climate wasn't ideal. There were frosts. Sometimes we'd get a lot of rain. Other times we wouldn't get any.
Nothing's changed with farming.
What's changed? Nothing.
Nothing. Reliant on the weather.
So the sugar plants got wet feet, or they were frostbitten. And etweventually, by the 1880s, sugar production in the whole of the Hastings had stopped. And of course, it moved more north into the Tweed mainly the Tweed Valley and other area, northern New South Wales, and in fact up into Queensland,
where it was a more sensible climate by the sound of it.
And so where it still exists today.
The lesson we can learn today: don't bother going and trying to grow sugar in Port Macquarie. It just doesn't work. No, it's happened twice before. Not good results.
But that's really quite a special thing about Port Macquarie, and a lot of people don't know that, and they really do think that sugar started even in Queensland and came down into northern New South Wales. In actual fact, it was grown around this area and then moved.
It's a bit of a dubious claim to fame, isn't it? Getting to success. However, it's there, and we take ownership of it. You're listening to Time to Talk, where we're talking about the top 5 things you may never have known about Port Macquarie's history. You can give us a call tonight too on 6585 3456 is our telephone number. We're joined by members of the Port Macquarie Historical Society. Now, Edmund Barton, he was Australia's first Prime Minister. Now, I was telling you both, I've convinced my sister that statue down there on the town green is actually a statue of Bill Clinton, because it looks remarkably like Bill Clinton.
That's really not fair, Tim.
I know, it's not very nice of me, is it? And she's believed me for 8 years. I hope she's not listening.
She's got to be a little sister.
No, she's a big sister.
She's a big sister.
And let me tell you, Linda, she deserves it. She deserves it. But that's
she's
obviously...
going to pay you back one day.
One day. Oh, she does that, don't worry. So Edmund Barton, that's the statue down there. What connection does he have with the Port Macquarie area?
Well, Edmund Barton needed a seat, actually, to stand for Parliament, and he had held other seats, but it was at quite a critical time just before the Federation, was forming, and so basically our local member here, James Henry Young, really helped get him into New South Wales Parliament, and that became the catalyst for him to become the first Prime Minister.
So we must be talking around 1890 or so.
We are we're actually talking about 1897, 1899.
Just before.
So just before. That was his kicking, the launching pad, if you like.
Did he live here?
He never lived here.
No. But he was our member.
He was indeed.
She wouldn't get away with that today, would
No, he would not get away with it today.
That'd be a scandal.
It would be very scandalous.
But when he became the Prime Minister, was he our member then?
Yes, he was.
So he was?
Just before then.
Did he have an office here? Did he ever visit here? Did he have any homes?
We've got photos of him on the boat.
He came here, I think he came here twice.
We've got a lot more to talk about with the history of Port Macquarie, but before we go any further, if people want to, off their own bat, learn more about Port Macquarie's history, see photos like the ones you're talking about, what can they do? Can they come to the museum and see this sort of stuff?
Well, we're in Clarence Street. We're very easy to find, straight opposite the old courthouse, just round the corner from the glass house.
And everything we're talking about tonight, people can find out more about in that building?
Yeah.
Indeed. We have 14 rooms in galleries, and they tell all the local stories the stories about our local history.
And if there are any teachers listening, school groups should be getting through your museum much more frequently than they do, because there's like we're talking about tonight, a fascinating history that we should know about if we live here.
And there's always something there. Our displays change pretty regularly, don't they, Deb?
They
Deb's
do
on
indeed.
the board with that.
And also we have lots of publications, so people can actually come along and purchase some of our...
Pictures from the Past is a fabulous book.
Yeah, and there's a great little publication called Federation Comes to Port, and it does talk quite a bit more about Edmund Barton and his role in Federation.
Very good. Now, World War II came surprisingly close to Port Macquarie. Tell us about it.
Very close to Port Macquarie. The Wollongbar was a coastal steamer. It was owned by the North Coast Steam Navigation Co. And it was, of course, confiscated by the government during the war, as were most ships. And because it had large storage facilities, cooling, like refrigeration facilities below decks, it was used to cart by the Merchant Navy during the war to cart produce. So it was leaving Byron Bay for Sydney, and that was on the 23rd of April, I think, wasn't it, Linda? Yeah, 28th of April in 1943. And the Japanese submarine was just off the coast near Point Plummer.
Is that right?
Yeah, and of course, looking through the periscope, they saw this ship with two funnels and a small gun, a 12-pounder gun on the front. And they thought, wow, 2 funnels, it's a bigger ship than what it really is. One of the funnels was a fake because it was classy to travel on a 2-funnel ship when you're a passenger than to go on a 1-funnel ship.
Wasn't that a mistake in hindsight?
You paid more,
wasn't it? So unfortunately for the 37 men on board, 32 lost their lives.
So it was torpedoed?
It was torpedoed, and it got 2 torpedoes. They may have only hit it with 1 had they known that it was a smaller ship, only had the 1 engine. But seeing the 2 funnels meant 2 engines, so bigger ship, we better give it 2 torpedoes. And we may have been able to save more lives. Local fishermen went out and rescued the 5 survivors and brought them back into Port Macquarie.
They must have been wounded
Well, one had all the skin burnt off him because he was near the boilers when they blew, and his skin was almost peeled right off him. But after 3 months in the local Port Macquarie hospital, his skin grew back, and we have a photograph of him holding his hands up showing the skin on his hands, and he said it's better than when he was a baby.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. I actually got hold of that man. He was in a nursing home and 85 years of age when we dedicated a room to the men on the Wollongbar up at the Maritime Museum. But he told us that day that he had gone on and survived another shipwreck up near New Guinea somewhere. I don't know the name of the ship that he was on.
Boy, oh boy.
But he wasn't meant to go in a shipwreck anyway. Wasn't his time.
No, clearly not.
To have a drowning death or death at sea.
So who would have thought World War II had come so close to Port Macquarie, hey?
This is right. A few of the fishermen,
we talk about Sydney Harbour, but I mean, we don't even know about our own history here.
That's right. Well, the captain of the Excelsior, the fishing boat that went out and saved the 5 survivors, he told me that they had been out fishing several occasions and a spotlight from a submarine had lit them up like as though it was daylight.
So they were on patrol out there?
They were patrolling the whole coast of Australia, right the way round.
And Tim, there was a bit of on that very sad occurrence of the sinking of the Wollongbar too, there was a big bonus really for locals.
How's that?
Because the ship was refrigerated, and it was the time of butter rationing. So there was a lot of butter to be had, we believe. And bacon. So it just all got washed ashore.
Is that right?
Boxes of butter.
And it was collected by people?
Indeed.
It was, really?
Yes, seriously, it was.
That is amazing.
And many people...
They have to buy the book if they want to read how many cases.
Many people speak very fondly of those times.
Of collecting the butter and the bacon on the shores of Port Macquarie.
Wonderful.
It was a windfall.
Wow. Well, it was the time of rationing, so I can
friend
understand.
of my mother's, she actually lived in Sydney and had a cake shop at the time, and she was married to a well-known local family of newsagents, and her brother-in-law put a case of butter on the train and sent it to her, and she was just over the moon because she had real butter to make cakes in her cake shop, because they just had to improvise with fat and lard and stuff. And you can imagine the taste was nothing like good old-fashioned real butter.
Isn't that amazing? A windfall out of a tragedy like that.
Yes.
Amazing stuff. And just finally, so many people don't understand, including myself, how Port Macquarie evolved from a largely timber and agricultural location, fishing into the holiday town that we are now. We're a tourist mecca. How did that evolution happen, and around when did it happen?
Well, it actually happened. A lot of people talk about the 1950s, the 1960s, but in fact, right from the early 1900s. So what happened was people did start to come here for a bit of R&R, and Linda mentioned the fishing village, and there were some really good fishermen here. And so people started coming here to learn to fish. They came here to play golf. They just came here to enjoy the climate. And so quite early on, and much earlier than people think, so really from the early 1900s, and there's a publication called Moore's Almanac, which records all the business people in towns across New South Wales, and it described Port Macquarie quite early on as being, fast becoming the pleasure resort of the North Coast.
And so, of course, business people would have seen that opportunity to capitalise on that, and I suppose that's when accommodation started opening, and then the trickle-on effect.
It's so cheap here compared to Sydney.
Yes, absolutely. And then I suppose the trickle-on effect is food establishments opening, restaurants, things like that.
And of course there was a period when we had a lot of theme parks and other things to do as well. So there's many of those are now closed, or in fact most of them are now closed, but we had quite a lot of different tourist attractions.
To huge insurances, that's put the death knell, I think, on our...
As amateur historians or people who are fascinated in our local history, what do you think? What's happening with our evolution today?
Well, I think we certainly are still a holiday place, and we probably will be for quite a long time. But of course, there's many of us who holiday here who then retire or decide to do other things and become the sea changers. So the whole really of the east coast of Australia is becoming sea change type of populations, and it'll be interesting to see whether there's much room left, I guess, for holiday makers because of all we sea changers.
And if we go down the education route, as we seem to be,
yes,
it could become a uni town. So what do you think the future holds for Port Macquarie in general?
Well, I think Port Macquarie will become obviously a larger regional centre, and I mean it already is becoming that.
Well, I've been here 32 years now, and the change that I've seen in 32 years has been astronomical.
Is it good change, Linda?
School.
Is it good?
I think so. Like in some ways, yes. I think we'd all like to keep it. Not quite the little fishing village that it was, but to keep it laid back.
Love to strike that balance.
But you hit Lake Road and your potholes on a Monday morning. It's just, or knock-off time on a Friday.
It doesn't feel laid back, does it?
It doesn't feel laid back at all. And even the Oxley Highway between here and Port is bumper to bumper at times.
Our population growth is expected to be quite large. So, we really are. We very much function like a suburb. And Wauchope's developing.
Just grown, the housing developments around.
And so are some of the other coastal towns in our region. So, yes, I think it's just going to be a bit like the suburbs.
The population's exploding.
But when we consider our future, we really need to put things in perspective and look back at our history, don't we? Because the fact is, Port Macquarie, just talk to Indigenous people, it's been a massive evolution, and it's never stopped evolving, this place, has it? No. So people who seem to get stuck on that idea about Port Macquarie and how it was in the 50s and the 60s, you've only got to look back further than that and realise we've never stopped changing and evolving.
We have a really rich and unique history, and that's what makes it that little bit special.
And the CSIRO keep telling us it's the best climate in Australia.
Well, it's meant to be the most temperate. Telegraph Point, technically, is the most temperate climate in Australia, they say.
Oh, right, okay. Telly Point.
I had 16 years.
Really?
Property prices are going to rise.
I hadn't seen a frost since I left Victoria until I moved to Wauchope.
Now, listen, Linda and Debbie, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the program tonight, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. It's been absolutely fascinating for me, at least, and I'm sure our listeners. Our listeners can give us a call tonight too on 6585 3456. Perhaps you have something to share about your knowledge of Port Macquarie's history. You're listening to the Time to Talk program.